So then we are back with more understandings from the time of the Second Tabernacle services, where we find the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of the Tzayelic lineage. So then we can understand the time of the end. As per Yiershiyahu the prophet, we find layers of understanding of the spring feast, the autumn feast, and also the returning of the cities of the Messiah laid waste for many centuries. As we read then Yiershiyahu the prophet, we must ask the question, why then Israel has destroyed its prophets. Then, from then on, we read then the understandings of the holy instructions and the enlightenment coming from then Daniel the prophet. Daniel was truly a prophet because he received understandings concerning then the future of the Gentile world, and then from the instructions we find then Egypt, very importantly, is at the moment at the waiting point of receiving more arms from the Soviet Union. As we understand, for instance, the Soviet Union has returned, but it has not yet divulged in the world yet. So then, from the point of the instructions, we then read in the verse 8 and 9, then Egypt returning, but it is a returning point where then does not influence the world's motion at the moment, or then the world's events, because Egypt had its time long ago. It was the most important nation in the planet. So then when the holy instructions, they gives us the understanding of for some time they would be placed aside. We are speaking of a spiritual understanding, so then later on people would understand what it meant because of the spiritual position of Egypt back many centuries ago. So then, as we understand, ISIL is every day stronger and stronger and stronger, and then you find the ISIL on Daniel chapter 11, where then they are thronging each other. If you read very slowly, you find, and this thronging at some point is going to stop. Why then it is halting? Because they are organizing themselves, and also China is then the kingdom of the East is coming with the system, and the new system via computer gives us then the ability of limiting the governments of the world's disorganizing and stealing. So then, since we are speaking of many layers at the same time, the evaluation comes then as the Soviet Union then providing arms for the Middle East, and then greatly diminishing the influence of the United States. So then, since the truth must be spoken, there are the steps of formation, and then obviously nations, as they know the truth, they take then obviously the proper measures to position themselves as the events are taking place. So then, as far as later on you find then the ships of Kittim, we are speaking of prophecies related with a time where the substance of the prophecies already had taken place. That's why then the understanding of the reflected understanding of the prophecies. This comes from an ancient teaching of then the temple, where then some of the ancient ones were teaching there was a reflected piece of metal as bronze that would then reflect at the priest to make sure he had no sin. But if you analyze these situations, got nothing to do with it, because the reflected understanding, he is obviously speaking of the holy instructions and the prophecies. Though don't want to discredit some sort of reflected piece of metal in a holy place or in the most holy place or whatever you want to say. However, the understanding of reflection is the interpretation of these holy prophecies based from the substance, the original substance, and these substances already had taken place. Then there is the projected or reflection of these prophecies. Sometimes it is understanding, sometimes it is not. But we are speaking with the reflections of the prophecies themselves that already had taken place. So then when we read then Hebrews, then you find in the Torah has then the prophetic shadow events. Shadow events has to do with a reflection. It is a similar word where then reflected and then shadows, they go hand to hand. Going back to Daniel, the prophet. These prophets, they were speaking the truth. These prophecies, let me say this once again, they are not for manipulation or for the control of the people. I'm going to say this again, it's not for the control of the people, neither manipulation. It's for us, so then we can understand the events of the time of the restoration period, because the Creator has not left any understanding outside. He has given complete understanding ever since the holy cities were around. So He is the very person with absolutely no blame in every way, in every analysis you make. He Himself is clean. So then, it's our task then of studying these holy prophecies, is studying then the substance of these prophecies and the reflections of them. So then we can position ourselves of what's going on in this time of the restoration of the holy cities, and then the layers related with the Gentiles. So we have a couple of situations. You have tabernacling, the returning of tabernacling, and the reflected prophecies of Daniel. So the ships of Kittim, when you read this portion, we are speaking of United States. Now, the situation is this also. There is the word of despised one also in the previous verses prior of the ships of Kittim. Now, this despising does not mean a situation where the country is unworthy. It simply means then the time given to the country was expired. So then there are other tasks that must take place. So then, as it was during the time of Great Britain, when the United States became then the top trader, as then the Great Britain, or the Britons, they became then diminishing from the world's scenario. Now, the word of diminishing simply means they were giving away those areas that were colonies. It is a form of diminishing, but does not mean the country then is unworthy. Have to understand the proper usage of these words, so then you can measure what it means then. Prophecies, the reflected, and then what they mean. Continue on. There is a section in Africa, northern section of Africa in Sudan. There is a place over there where the great prophet Yiershiyahu has mentioned regarding then the first holy city. As we understand, Sudan at the moment is at war, so I truly do not know as far as when some of the Hebrews are going to have the courage to put their rears in gear and go over there and then going around those projectiles and find out where then the first holy city of the restoration period is going to be at. And most of these Hebrews are wishy-washy. They don't want anything to do with war. They don't like war. They don't want to be involved with it. They want only easy life and so on and so forth. So there are not very many people involved with this as far as we can understand from the media. The Creator might have people set aside for this purpose, but as we read from any media at the moment, we don't find much information. So then, later on we find in tabernacling. Tabernacling must be set up as per the instructions of the prophet Yiershiyahu. It must be set up as he explained. Though Yiershiyahu the prophet was sawn in half, he was murdered by Israel. Israel, the leaders, they have gathered themselves and they have taken this holy prophet of Yahweh, had taken him to the Kidron place over there, and he was sawn in half. He was murdered because Israel refused understanding and clarity as far as prophecies were concerned. We have the prophecies today, so we don't do what Israel did. Let's make sure when a person is explaining the holy instructions and the prophecies, make sure don't murder the person. So then, you find then Sudan. Later, you find then another section beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. Now, there is a section of Daniel related with the Gentiles, and a section of Daniel related with tabernacling. You find a section of Daniel related with the sons of Ishmael. You find in a section of Daniel related with the sons of Yitzhak. You find in a section related with the Gentiles as far as China. You find in the kingdom of the East in the new system. We find then the riches of Congo. Because of its many riches, many mines, many areas over there where they are absolutely at war against the factions over there, and the warlords are obviously in charge of the place. So these dynamics, each of them working as per the instructions of the prophets. At the moment we are finding then Yiershiyahu, he is then the prophet who had the most concentrated prophecies of the entire history of this planet. Later on you find other prophets only having a portion of what Yiershiyahu then spoke. As we understand then later on, when the city then is set up, then you find then that there is a military action taking place. Now, this military action mostly comes from the Soviet Union. As we understand, later on you find then they will to come with much equipment and then a great army. Then we find that only the covenant of the false Messiah. You find a covenant of the false Messiah, and you find then the abomination that makes desolate. Now there is a reflection of these abominations that makes desolate. We understand the Hebrews, they want the third temple. So they are working towards this temple. We understand Mount Moriah, no person is going to rule that place except the Arabs. But then we understand next to the Dome of the Rock, there is a place over there where it used to be the most holy and the Holy of Holies. But then continue on with Daniel. Then later on, with the influence of the Soviet Union, then giving arms to the Middle East, then you find then the covenant. You find then a representative of the old covenant. You find then an exactor. And then you find tabernacling. You find then the despised one in the United States because it is diminishing its influence, not because the country is unworthy. Same situation is with Great Britain when they were diminishing, but yet they were not in a position of being unworthy. So each of those understandings must be then layered properly. And it's coming a time where then the conflict of ISIL and then some sections of Daniel, the 11th chapter, explains of southbound versus the kingdom of the south. Some sections of Daniel, the 11th chapter, explains then northbound versus the northern kingdom. These then situations we should make a reference with Revelation and a reference with Yiershiyahu the prophet. So then, later on then comes the returning of the ships of the United States. So then, as far as a time frame, this is where we should be extremely cautious, because it has given couple of years for the world then to organize themselves, so then the new system of China then can be used. At the moment, we understand there is in Barcelona, Spain, a very important gathering of mobiles and new systems of payments that's going to be obviously included, and then these systems being used around the world. Combining these, combining with the system of China, combining with, we are in the midst of a 6-month period, or then the banks, the private banks of China, are then developing a bank or banks exclusively for the new system. So these are, each of them, a layer of understanding, so then we understand the events. Some countries are bankrupt. Brazil, for instance, is on the verge of a total ruin. Our only option at the moment is having a talk with the International Monetary Fund and having some money from them, having them lend us some money, because the country is bankrupt. The Petroleum State Company is bankrupt. They are going to do an inventory. They have hired J.P. Morgan from the United States to do an inventory of the properties of the state company to try to get some money from. And as we understand, they want $3 billion US dollars for these work worth of J.P. Morgan's work. The state's company have invested $221 billion US dollars in a system where it's simply not worthy of developing. because of the price of crude. So Brazil is absolutely bankrupt, in the verge of collapse. So then, the encouragement we have as far as a nation is reading the holy instructions. It's the only hope. Understandably, people these days, they are not 100% holy as the prophets of Israel, or then those people who were set aside for the preaching and teaching of the word. Now comes then the situation regarding then the navies of the world. Another layer we should consider very closely is then the movement of ships. Why do we say then the movement of ships? Because Revelation is directly linked with Daniel. The 8th chapter of Revelation, for instance, reveals then the ships. So then, in a proper understanding, when you understand later on the ships retrieving, we understand the ships of the United States, mostly the military. They're going to return home. However, the submarine warfare must increase. The influence of ships and places in this world is taking place, for instance, has taken place with Great Britain some 250 years ago, roughly, and then is taking place with United States. And because of these, then the submarine warfare is in utmost demand worldwide. Because as you remove then ships from the surface, you have to have some security down below. And because of the holy instructions, and we can't ignore the holy instructions, so the ships of the United States must retrieve. As far as the quantity, we don't know. We don't know how many, we don't know where. But since we understand the despised one from the viewpoint of diminishing, we already have a history of Great Britain, so then you have an idea with the United States. Now, there is a time for them at least to get themselves organized, and then making sure the world understands what China is doing, because the new system must be then implemented. Now, each of these dynamics, they are working with each other. So, as you can observe, each of those layers, they must be properly placed. So then, navigating through the holy instructions, then we understand what the Messiah said many centuries ago. Not a layer of the holy instructions are going to be left undone. Many people, when they translate the scripture, they say not a jot or a tittle is going to be left aside. But it's not these that Messiah was explaining. He was explaining of the layers. Each of those layers, each of them must be completed, and none of them is going to be left aside. So then, as far as the time frame, we understand that this very moment we are in Daniel, the 11th chapter, verses 8 and 9. Until the ships of Kittim, it have some 30 verses. Now, these are not divided up by time, or then a specific proportional time. Some events are going to take place very fast. Some of them are going to take longer. But we do understand a couple of situations. We understand a couple of years China then has given, because they're going to launch many of their systems around the world, and then the next 6 months also was given, and then is going to be completing 5 years as far as what the PM of Israel some time ago has said. So then each of these layers, then they have a specific time. As far as tabernacling, we understand then the northern section of Africa is at war, and we don't know who is over there, who is doing the work over there. I tried myself to go over there at least twice, couldn't get the visa. At least to roam around that place and trying to find where then the holy site is going to be at. And then the fortifying of the holy city by then the Soviets. Then later on you find then the despised one, and then you find the system, you find the diminishing of the United States, but then the reorganizing of the system, and then later on finds then the system. You find then the despised one coming out of the deal with the great wealth. This situation can be only understood as far as a new system, where then the computerized systems of China is linked directly with United States, and then taxes are then deducted per purchase via computer. Thus then a link with the system itself and the freighters. So it's not as simple as people are thinking. It is somewhat complex. And then when you combine each freighter of this earth being linked with local governments and using these systems, I would say for a person that is absolutely knowledgeable of computers, if you talk with them in a level, they might say it's not that complicated. But when we come from a place where then the world was then 1,000 years in a certain way, and then later on changes, it has a transitional time, and then the inclusion of computers linked up with the local governments, linked up with the money printing machine, linked up with the packages, linked up with the credit cards, linked up with the local banks. You understand the enormity of the situation. So then there is a definite transition taking place. As far as timing, it is very crucial. The only timing we can give as far as the ships of Kittin, it is somewhere roughly 10 years or so. So there is quite some time yet. But then, to get to this point of 10 years, there are lots of situations taking place. As it was explained before, as the war, yet the civil war in Sudan is taking place, we don't know when it's going to finish. We know that in the area where the Sudan back then was Ethiopia, that's where then the Queen of Sheba visited with Solomon. We understand she brought then a copy of the Holy Ark of the Covenant and a copy of the Torah. That's why Ethiopia is so spoken of during times past. We understand there is a holy city going on over there. We understand the organization of Congo. We understand the place beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. We understand then the violent ones urging and demanding the setup of tabernacling in the northern side of Sudan, or where it used to be Beit Israel, the place where then Yohanan or John was at, and he formed the first holy city as per the instructions of the holy prophet. Now, as far as linking up with our everyday lives is the responsibility of each person studying the holy instructions. Now, it is studying in a way where you gather facts and you do not manipulate any person. So then, later on, I'm going to evaluate more of Daniel, the 11th chapter, and then also Revelation. Because not only we are speaking of roughly a half hour, couldn't get not even a 10% of the content that must be spoken of. So then these can be obviously understood from one point to another point. But it is truly exhausting. Speaking of these layers, it is exhausting. Some people who do not read, they only listen, they think it's easy speaking of, but it is not. It is absolutely the utmost exhausting. Because each layer must be given properly, so then each line must be then compared with each other and lined up as per what the prophets spoke. So we're going to include then later on Revelation with it. So please stay tuned. Much more coming up.